Welcome, everybody. Um, Thank you for joining us today. I know that there's a lot going on these days with the start of the new year, and obviously I'm here, several of us are here in California, and many of our friends
But
in,
you don't have to be camera on, do you?
No.
Okay.
oh, do you mind muting, please? Thank you. And so many of our friends and colleagues and loved ones are dealing with the fires in Southern California. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. And I know in other parts of the country, there have been some extreme cold weather going through. Um, I'm Elaine Ikeda. I'm the executive director of Lead California. And it's an honor today for me to co-moderate this webinar with my friend and colleague, Dr. Dave Donahue. I'll say more about him in a little bit. And I'm pleased that we will be in conversation with our main speaker, Dr. Rachel Brand, who will be sharing her dissertation research with you shortly. I want to take a moment to provide some background on this webinar series for those of you who may not have attended a previous session. The Dissertation Dish is a collaboration between the International Association for Research on Service Learning and Community Engagement, we call it IRSLICE, Lead California, and GivePulse. Dissertation Dish webinars are meant for all audience, from seasoned scholars to practitioners to graduate students. And these webinars serve to highlight some of the most recent research in the community engagement field. We want to create a way for journal editors and conference organizers to be exposed to new research and potential presenters, and offer some support and possible guidance for those who are in graduate programs by way of tips from those who have just gone through the experience. So far, we've hosted 14 Dissertation Dish webinars, and we have had over 800 unique individuals who have attended those webinars. And so we're excited for you to join us today as we feature the dissertation of Dr. Rachel Brand, who teaches child studies at Santa Clara University. Dr. Brand will be discussing her dissertation topic, students as co-researchers using participatory action research to address college food insecurity. After the presentation, I will work with my esteemed co-moderator, Dr. David Donahue, Professor of Education at the University of San Diego, and will facilitate the Q&A. And finally, for those who can stick around past the first hour, we hope you'll join the informal conversation with Dr. Brand for an additional 30 minutes. So before we begin the presentation, I have a few logistical items. We recommend you select speaker mode in your Zoom panel, as there are many people on the call, and this will allow you to keep the speakers front and center, although since we spotlight them, maybe that won't be an issue. Kindly mute yourself during the presentation, and if you have any questions during the webinar, go ahead and post those in the chat, and we will be keeping track of your questions for the Q&A session a little later. And lastly, a reminder that we are recording this webinar, and it will be available within a few days on the Lead California's YouTube channel, and we will also send you a link to everyone who registers will get a link to the recording. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to my co-moderator, Dr. David Donahue, so he can introduce himself and our dissertation dish speaker. Dave?
All right. Thank you, Elaine. Thank you, Lead California. Thank you, Give Pulse. Thank you, IRSlice, for sponsoring today. It's really an honor to join you all. I have been a practitioner and scholar of community engaged learning for over 30 years. I started my career many years ago as a high school social studies teacher. Doing community engaged work. I continued that for over 20 years at Mills College in Oakland, California, as a member of the faculty there, and then later part of the administration, and most recently in the last 10 years at the University of San Francisco, where I am currently a professor in the School of Education. When I first came here, I was the director of the McCarthy Center for Public Service and the Common Good, which is the university's Center for Community Engaged Teaching, Learning, and Scholarship. And it's in that role and in that space where you get to know who are the faculty at USF doing the coolest, most wonderful, neatest community engaged scholarship. And it's in that context that I first got to know Rachel Brand. And so I know that you're in for a real treat today to learn more about her work. She came to my attention because I was hearing great things from students, from colleagues about the classes that she was teaching in environmental studies and all the great innovative community engaged work that was part of those courses. Um, in fact, Rachel's won numerous awards for her teaching at USF, and I was pleased to be able to nominate her for the 2022 Innovations in Teaching Award at the university, which she won. No longer at USF, though, which is sad for those of us still here. Currently, Dr. Brand teaches in the Child Studies Department at Santa Clara University. She has over a decade of experience teaching community engaged learning, critical food systems education, and environmental studies courses. Her scholarship focuses on participatory action research in higher education, student agency and collective action, humanizing education, and food and environmental justice. Rachel holds an MA in sociology from the University of California at Santa Cruz and an EDD in international and multicultural education from the University of San Francisco. As a member of her dissertation committee, I can attest that you are all going to learn much in this dish today. So with that, I am turning it over to Rachel.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate all of you who were able to attend, and I wanted to give a special thank you to Brian Halderman from Give Pulse, who's going to be helping out and moving my slides today and has been essential in the organization of this, and of course to Dr. Elaine Ikeda from Lead California for inviting me. I really appreciate that. And Dr. Dave Donahue, who I had the pleasure of working with at USF, who's moderating today and who has been of huge support throughout my academic journey. So thank you to all of you. I'm here to talk about my research for my dissertation. I conducted the research in 2021 and received my doctorate from the University of San Francisco in 2023. I used participatory action research to address college food insecurity. And the research that I'm going to talk about today looks at college food insecurity as an issue that plagues college students. Especially in light of the fires in Southern California, I wanted to draw attention to that, and students who are struggling for food becomes obviously an even bigger problem when we have disasters such as the fires. This research also looks at participatory action research as a teaching and community building tool to address social problems and engage students in their coursework. And it looks at the experiences and outcomes of using PAR, participatory action research, I'll start calling it PAR at this point, to address campus issues. So what this experience did for students in terms of their agency and their sense of community and their collective action, how it helped them to learn academic subject of food justice and environmental studies, what it did for me as their professor and the profound impacts that this had on my teaching, and then finally the surprising results in how much this meant for the students, and also how wonderful PAR is as a form of research for those of you who are interested in using it for your dissertations. So I hope to walk you through all of those topics today. Next slide, please. So my dissertation research is about college food insecurity, and I came about this because I was actually an adjunct professor at the University of San Francisco for about 7 years before I decided to join their doctoral program in education and international multicultural education. So while I was a student there, I was also on the faculty as an adjunct professor, and I had taught urban agriculture and food systems for many years and had students during that time study food insecurity in the United States. During the time of having discussions with students about food insecurity, many students confided in me that they themselves had experienced food insecurity, many of them growing up, but also many of them currently while they were in college. And so in my classes, we worked in both the classroom and in our school community, the USF community garden. And we often cooked and ate meals together as part of our day. And for many of the students, this was their only meal of the day. So we had many conversations as a group about being food insecure as a college student and how that impacted their experience. So when I had the opportunity to figure out what I wanted to write about and research for my dissertation, it felt like the perfect opportunity to conduct a study that I had been in conversation about for many years. Throughout this presentation and just generally when I was conducting this research, I used the USDA definition of food insecurity, which applies to food insecurity in the United States and also applies to college food insecurity. And that is the limited or uncertain availability of nutritionally adequate and safe foods, or limited or uncertain ability to acquire acceptable foods in socially acceptable ways. There are many studies out there about college food insecurity at this point, and most of them use this same definition. And also, for those that have used quantitative methods to survey numbers of students who are food insecure, they'll use the same survey tool as the USDA uses to understand food insecurity in the United States. It's called the US Household Food Insecurity Survey. So if anyone's interested, you might look into that survey further to kind of see some of the details around how we decide if a student or a person is low in food insecurity or high in food insecurity. There's a lot of methodology that goes into that understanding. This study itself isn't so much about the nitty-gritty of food insecurity or levels of food insecurity, but more about how students deal with this complicated social issue while they're in college and what it means to study food insecurity through their lived experiences collectively through participatory action research. Next slide, please. The basis of this project was looking at college food insecurity. Some of the previous research that's been conducted about this issue has informed us that somewhere around half of college students in the United States experience some level of food insecurity. We know that students have very high costs while they're in college. So the cost of tuition, books, and rent are found to have often take precedence over purchasing food. We found that that food insecurity impacts marginalized students at higher rates. So veterans, first generation students, previously food insecure students, low income students, students of color face this issue the most. And there's also many reported challenges that students have discussed about being food insecure, such as to their mental and physical health, their feelings of connection to their university. So this research was already something that I knew quite a bit about and that my students had read, but I wanted to use participatory action research to address this topic because I hadn't seen that form of research being used. In fact, there was really no studies that I found that use student-centered participatory research methods. And while there were studies that looked at student voice in terms of interviews, they hadn't looked at how students themselves can help to address this issue by being part of the research. And so that was really what I wanted to find out. The research was implemented at the University of San Francisco. And I did this research with two groups of 20 undergraduate students. I was teaching two sections of a course at the time, and I decided to implement a PAR project in both of the classes. Originally, my goal was to choose one of them to write about, but in the end, I had so much wonderful data, and I found that there was so much insight coming from both classes that I ended up writing about the experiences with both of the classes. The students in the classes came from a variety of majors and diversity of backgrounds. It was a community engaged learning course, which is a required course at the University of San Francisco. So I got students from across campus, which was really wonderful and really helpful in understanding how widespread the issue of food insecurity was. And we did this over a 15-week semester, so it was a 15-week project. And it also happened to coincide with being the first semester when students were back after the COVID closures. So that had a huge impact on our project and the desire for community engagement as well. Students were very hungry for to engage with one another and to make friends. So the question that led our inquiry, which students came up with themselves, was how can we improve food equity on campus? And how can PAR address college food insecurity? Next slide. I wanted to walk through participatory action research a little bit. I imagine that many people here already have a sense of how this cycle works, but I will just speak about it briefly. So at the beginning of the semester, what we did is we identified the problem. And I actually gave students a range of food systems related issues that they could choose from in terms of what would be our PAR project. And food insecurity really spoke to students, and it was quite a perfect issue to address because it was something that we could deal with on campus and make change on campus. So students identified the problem, they researched the problem, and in order to do this research, they looked into research that was already out there about college food insecurity. And they looked through the research and saw what they thought were holes or gaps in the research. And they decided that they wanted to conduct their own original research, which I'll discuss a little bit more soon. And they had to really learn research methods for that step because a lot of them had never taken a research methods course before. So we discussed what quantitative and qualitative research methods might look like and how to collect data. They conducted their original research, and they also analyzed that research. So they collectively coded that research and looked for themes. And from there, they developed a plan of action to address the problem. Once they came up with their action projects, they implemented those action projects, and then they evaluated the action after it was done. And that was basically the end of our semester. Next slide. So one of the important components of this project was the research itself. And so I wanted to speak to that a little bit more. Many of the students who conducted the research and who were in the class were actually food insecure themselves. So they played a really large role in terms of helping other students to understand the problem through their lived experience, and also helping us to design the research questions. We didn't ask them to do this, but many students really stepped up and said, hey, here are the questions that I would like to be asked if someone was conducting research about this issue that I'm facing. So the students designed original research. They came up with research questions. They really wanted to learn about the lived experiences of the students. They also administered a large-scale survey with 146 participants to look at food insecurity on campus, and they conducted 28 in-depth interviews with students. One interview with an administrator, and they also gave us 2 testimonials. They identified themes and coded the data. And the bulk of the research and the outcomes and the themes that we found came from the in-depth interviews. That was where most of the impactful research came from. Next slide. So after conducting the research and analyzing it collectively in groups, we found themes. And a lot of the themes reflected some of the research that had been conducted previously that they found, when they were looking at the existing research. But many of the themes were also new, and that was their goal, was to really think about with these new themes and outcomes that we found, how do we address food insecurity on our campus? What do we do to help USF students themselves feel that food insecurity is not as big of an issue in their lives? So they found that students did experience food insecurity. They found that 43.5 of those surveyed struggled with some degree of food insecurity. And 32.2% had worried about where they would get their next meal. One of the biggest outcomes was the impacts to social relationships. They found that students talked about not eating out with others or missing out on experiences around food. One of the common themes that also arose from the social relationships was not really wanting to talk about being food insecure and feeling some kind of shame or stigma about not being able to eat out with others. They found that food resources on campus felt inadequate, so they were understaffed or underfunded and had limited amounts of foods. And they felt very frustrated with the USF meal plan in the cafeteria. They felt the food was too expensive and the meal plan was flawed. And one of the bigger pieces of this was that they also felt that there was no one to really talk to about it. If they tried to talk to someone about it, they felt that their complaints fell flat and that the issue wasn't really taken seriously. Some of the other really important themes that arose from this research was that there was no collective understanding of food insecurity. And this piece was very important to the students because for themselves and for those that they interviewed, they found that through the interview process, a student might start out by saying, "Oh no, I'm not food insecure." But then after having an hour-long, conversation, the 20-minute interview, and then they would talk with their friends more about this, they would find that often by the end, a student would say, "Oh wait, I actually am food insecure, and that's not something that I ever identified." They often thought, "Oh, well, I'm not, doing a great job of managing my money," or well, I'm just too busy. And so it took a while for students to kind of get this collective understanding of food insecurity. They also found that there was a perception that everybody on campus could easily afford food. It's a private university, and there was an assumption that a lot of students had money, and that maybe those who are struggling with food insecurity were struggling on their own, not realizing that other students were also experiencing food insecurity as well. There was also a stigma and shame attached to needing food resources, and students felt that a lot of the resources were in the food pantry, which they appreciated, but they felt that it was a hidden venue. So you would go there and you wouldn't really see people, and it kind of became, they felt it added to the stigma of being food insecure. Next slide, please. So after analyzing the data and finding these themes, the students developed several projects. And behind the projects was a framework that I'll speak more about. So there's an alignment between how they want the university to approach food insecurity and the types of projects that they came up with. Next slide, please. The action projects were the following. They came up with a link tree, so they wanted a way that students could find food resources easily. And the link tree was a place where you could open the links, know where you were going to go any day of the week. They created a blurb that went into all the syllabi across campus, and it spoke about food insecurity, gave a definition, and also spoke to where the resources were that students could find. They wrote a letter and petition to the administration with proposed changes to the meal plan. And I think one of their favorite outcomes were numerous events that they put on to educate the larger community about food security issues. And some of these events included seed planting, educational information, free fresh food, and joyful activities that they could do together, where students were able to eat publicly with one another, to address the social issue of not being able to join others in meals and also be able to eat at the same time. They also developed a USF Food Sovereignty Coalition. And the idea behind this coalition was that both admin, professors, and students would come together and discuss the issue of food insecurity with one another, have meals, and kind of make this issue more public. Next slide, please. The students also created a zine. I thought this was a pretty fun outcome. It was about food insecurity. It has where the resources are, phone numbers you can call, and it's a piece of paper that you fold up and it makes a little magazine. And so they did a workshop where they would make these little zines with students as they talked about food insecurity as a way to have fun and talk about the issue in kind of an artistic and creative way. Next slide, please. So in terms of the student events, they had many events. These are just some photos of the events. So here they are harvesting honey. They had a plant giveaway. They made a lot of food and gave away free soup, free food. And the goal was to create a space where students could connect to food resources in a really fun and informal way. It wasn't hidden like their critique of the food pantry. And it created a way for students to come together with friends, to talk about food insecurity, to have resources, to find their resources, and to hear about places like the food pantry, which many of them had never heard about before. They focused on creating joyful and informative experiences. Next slide, please. So in addition to the successful and fun events, the students hope to change the university's approach to food so that some of their ideas were institutionalized for the longer term. They felt that when they left the university that maybe some of these events and ideas might fall away. And so they wanted to kind of try to engage with the administrators and with the school in a way for there to be a future with their projects. They came up with a list of goals, which included transparency about the cafeteria and food costs, the prices, and the effect on the student population. They wanted to establish trust between students and administrators regarding food systems issues on campus. They hoped to create a culture of community care that decreased the stigma of food insecurity and took food insecurity seriously. They wanted student agency and empowerment regarding issues on campus, including food insecurity, but any issue that students faced. They hoped for students, faculty, and administrators to be united in solidarity for change. They wanted equity for all students in their academic and social lives. They wanted to center students' stories and experiences when building food insecurity strategies. And they hoped for a robust web of food resources for students. So this was their list that they came up with. And as part of their projects, they also had meetings with administrators, with the provost, in order to try and put forward these ideas. Next slide, please. I wanted to talk a little bit about the transformation that students went through because of this process. Students felt that they built community, they felt a sense of agency, of trust, and collective action. This was a really important experience for the students. They academically learned about food insecurity and food justice and food systems issues in the United States, but were able to focus in on food insecurity on campus and build their own community through this experience. Next slide, please. I have a few quotes. You're welcome to read them, and I'll try and summarize them that speak to the student reflections about our project. This one says, "Par made me realize the impact I could have on the community, that she had waited for her whole life she had believed that someone else would have more power to speak up, but that she was able to understand that she had the power and people have power, and that it only takes a group of passionate people, determination to improve issues on campus, and some good soup to make a difference." Next slide. And another person spoke to the importance of PAR and that the experience was special not only because they implemented different ways to combat serious hidden issues, but because of the community that they created. She speaks to how when they were in charge of student events, they didn't have to make a spreadsheet or go out of our way to test recipes at friends' houses, that they did what was beyond what was required or needed from the class. They did the extra work because it was what we needed. And then the next slide, please. And then finally, this student reflection speaks to how PAR was such an essential experience to reconnect to community. She said it was nice to finally be back in community with each other after the pandemic and take part in projects, how healing the projects were, and that the pandemic had felt so isolating with all the injustices happening. It felt as if they couldn't do anything, and how they're still in touch with friends from the course. Next slide, please. And finally, I wanted to talk a little bit about my own reflections from this experience. For me as a professor, this was a very transformative teaching experience. I found that students engaged more deeply in the academics that I was teaching them because of the research component. And few students had conducted research before. And so adding this level into the course was really profound. Students were very proud of themselves for their accomplishments, and you could really see the growth and the sense of agency. It was a very exciting and dynamic way to be teaching and also simultaneously writing my dissertation. I spent the whole semester also reflecting on the experiences and recording every class and transcribing every class. And so while I was teaching, I was also using all the data that I found to reflect and start to put together my dissertation. And it was so community building, it was active, and it was very lively, and it was just a fantastic way to teach and to write a dissertation and to learn myself. Next slide, please. And I've written about different aspects of this experience. So the first article that should be coming out soon looks at, it was myself and two others who used PAR in for our dissertations, for our research. So if anybody here is interested in how to use PAR for your dissertation, that might be a great article to read. We talk about what the experience was like and our outcomes. And I wrote an article that looks at student resistance, more of how students were empowered, their sense of agency and collective action, and how that came out through this project. I wrote about participatory action research in Jesuit higher education, since USF is a Jesuit school, and how the mission of the school itself helped to reinforce the ideas of what we were trying to do in the classroom. And then finally, I also wrote about using PAR to address food insecurity, looking more closely at food insecurity itself. Next slide. And yeah, so that's it. Thank you so much. And I would love to discuss further with everyone here. Thank you. Thank you for moving the slides for me as well.
Thank you, Rachel. Dave, did you want to share any quick reflections?
Well, I promised people that they would have a real treat today, and they did. Rachel, thanks. That was so inspiring. And I think there is so much in your presentation for us to think about today, both in terms of your pedagogy, in terms of your research and your methodologies, and then just the content of what you were exploring as well. So I know we've already got a number of questions starting to populate the chat. And so I encourage people to put questions in the chat, and Elaine and I will pick from those. We've also come up with questions ahead of time. So if you run out or you feel pressured to come up with a question, don't worry. We can keep the conversation going too. One of the first questions that did pop into the chat while you were talking, Rachel, I'll share it now, is about the IRB and informed consent process, and whether that was integrated into the class project, and if so, what did that look like? And maybe this is an opportunity for you to just talk a little bit in general too about like any ethical issues you faced, like teaching a class, but also looking at it as a site for your research and your dissertation too.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I did get IRB approval, and at the beginning of the semester, I told all the students that if they didn't want to they would participate in the PAR project either way, because that was our course. But I would only write about their experiences if they wanted me to. And so they signed consent forms. All but one student agreed to be a part of the project in that way. So that part was actually turned out to be pretty easy. I was curious to see whether or not students would want to have me write about the experience and quote them. It's all anonymous. I let them choose the names that they wanted to use. So there's no way to trace back to who those students actually are. Um, and it was an interesting thing being a professor and conducting this research, because I didn't want them to feel like they had to be a part of my research because of their grade. So I taught in a pretty different way. The only homework that they had was personal reflections. I made it so that all of the in class work, so the projects, the events, the coming up with the questions, all of that took place during class hours, because I wanted to make sure that it wasn't something that, well, if you had, all this extra time to conduct all this extra research, that you would get a better grade. I wanted to make sure it was very equitable. So we did all of the research and the event planning and everything during class hours. I was lucky to have a class that met once a week for 3.5 hours. So we had a great big chunk of time to work on this. And also, I really wanted to be careful that, because when you read about food insecurity, you find that students who are food insecure are also the students who are often working 2 jobs in addition to going to school. So I didn't want our project to end up being this extra burden that students were facing. So that was the way that I dealt with it. And everyone did a really good job in the class. Their grade was based on our communal work. And, they only, if someone, well, we didn't even yeah, it just ended up working out really well. Yeah. Thank you.
Great. There's a question in the chat from Emily. What was the university's response to the asks that the students came up with? And actually, how did you share those with the or university?
Yeah, we had 2 big supporters. So one was our provost. She was very supportive. And we also, the university ministry, which is an entity on campus, we we um, we met with both of those people a lot during the semester, and wrote letters to the president. Overall, everybody, the admin was very supportive. The issue that showed up was after the semester was over, and the changes that happened. Like, I left, students left, provost switched. It's like the all of the changes. The problem was in the longevity of our projects and our goals through transition. So that's something that, I think we would really have to think about and figure out how to deal with, how to make these changes last over time. But we got quite, in the moment, we got quite a bit of support. And that was really exciting for the students, especially because they had felt, they reported having felt like the admin doesn't care, or people aren't really paying attention to this. But then they found that once they started really engaging, um, that people were very responsive to them and really wanted to help, and that everyone was kind of working together. So it was empowering for them, at least throughout our semester.
Great. I will say one thing that outlives your class, and as a USF professor, I can attest to this. The syllabus blurb does live on. increasingly syllabi are contracts, and there's all kinds of information about all sorts of things. And it's just really important, I think, that there's now a standardized paragraph that faculty can put in about food resources on campus for students. So
That's great to hear.
related to that, somebody was asking a question about was there anything that you discovered that helps students open up more or feel more comfortable about talking about an issue like food insecurity and perhaps their own food insecurity as well?
Mm. Yeah, a lot of group work, a lot of time together. And I think really building the community um, can't be underestimated. A lot of time doing work in the classroom and outside in the garden worked well for me in terms of establishing relationships and helping students to open up. I think we also did a really wonderful job in the classroom um, of of centering the experiences of food insecure students so that students felt like they could speak to their own experience, and that in fact speaking to their experience was valued and really helped generate ideas for our class. And in addition, everybody in the class, whether or not they were food insecure themselves, knew somebody who was food insecure. So it was because it was that common. So because of that, um, the community could really be built around a shared knowledge and a shared desire to help one another through these experiences. But I think the fact that there was a really strong commitment to group work um, was what was the most impactful.
You might have mentioned this, and so I'm sorry if I'm asking you to repeat, but was this a elective course and it was undergraduates, I'm assuming. I'm not sure you said much about USF. I mean, except I heard you say it was private, but if folks aren't from California, they may not be as familiar, but could you just, and again, I'm sorry if you actually did mention it.
Yeah, I don't know that I did. So thanks for asking. Yeah, USF, it's a Jesuit Catholic school. It's in San Francisco. Um, Dave, is it 6,000 students about? So maybe mid-size
Undergraduate, yeah.
undergrad. Yeah, and this was an undergraduate course. There's a community engaged learning requirement that all students have to take. And because of that, students sign up for this course, whether or not they're a biology major, engineering, all across the campus. So you get a large variety of students. Most students who take the community engaged learning course are juniors or seniors, but many students in that quarter happen to, or sorry, semester also happen to be freshmen. Um, and that was really interesting for our work because some students were facing food insecurity who were actually at the university, who actually had the cafeteria meal plan, whereas others were facing food insecurity as students who lived off campus. And the reasoning for their food insecurity was different. So for students who were on the meal plan, maybe they used up too much of their meal plan early on, and then they didn't have anything left. Whereas students who are off campus were trying to, had any number of reasons why they were food insecure, but they were dealing with it off campus. So we had a really interesting cross section of students from the university.
One of the things that fascinated me about your dissertation, we've talked a little bit about this, and we've said we would even write about it, and we certainly should. But at the same time that students felt so empowered as agents of change because of their experience in this course, one of the things you found is that many students also kind of harbored a little bit of resentment that they had to do this change work and that it wasn't their job, and that why isn't the university taking care to make sure people are you know, resourced enough and have nutrition. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about where maybe that comes from and what are the implications then for teaching community engaged learning courses where we want students to actually work on the real issues in the world, and where that has these positive outcomes, but then students maybe coming from a neoliberal perspective or thinking like, why should I have to do this? And it gets in the way of getting my education. I don't know. I'd love to hear you talk more about that.
Yeah, this is such an interesting conversation, and Dave and I have spoke about this in the past. And I found that when students were doing community engaged learning in the greater community, Like, let's say in past semesters, I had done projects where we worked at soup kitchens, or we were feeding homeless people in San Francisco. The students really had no problem, and in fact wanted to do that, and that felt very fulfilling. The place where I met student resistance was doing projects to address the issues that they were facing themselves, and there was a strong level of, and I have a lot of quotes around this, of resentment, that they were having to do the work that they wanted the university to do. Over time, throughout the semester, by the end, that pretty much usually changed. So by the end, they felt they didn't feel that resentment anymore, but that was because of, not because of what the university had done, but because of what they saw that they got out of doing community engagement with their peers. So like that sense of community, um, being able to help other people, really overrode that resentment. But I think that that piece is really interesting. And I think because students are paying so much for college these days, there's, and I don't want to speak, if anybody here is a college student, I would love to hear from you. But what I've found from my conversations with students is that um, because of that amount of burden it was the college experience is placing on their family, and the amount that their families have had to stretch, that they would wanted more from the university in return in terms of their basic needs being fulfilled.
So I'm impressed by the number of articles you already have, or chapters, um, and I think that's fantastic that you've already gotten your dissertation results and findings and perspective out there. Um, and I know we have some folks on the call who might be starting their own dissertation process, or writing or research. And so I don't know if you can share a little. We usually ask our presenters to share one or two of their tips, if they have any. What got them through? Is there something that in particular? I mean, also you were using a different methodology than many others. Then it's not as traditional, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. But anyway, so any tips you have for something that particularly worked well for you in any part of the dissertation process, whether it was getting the writing done, or even if you want to say anything about how and why you've chosen to do articles. I mean, right here we heard Dave saying, "Oh, we got to write that up." So
Yeah, thank you for the question. I chose to do the 3 article format as opposed to doing the one big dissertation. If anybody here works with grad students, I would recommend giving that option, that students could do a 3 article. I think depending on the point that one is at in their career, it can be beneficial to do articles instead of doing one large dissertation. For me personally, I was at a place where the more publishing that I could have, the better. And so I chose that route because I felt like it would be beneficial for my career. And also, I felt that maybe it would get out to more people more quickly. Some of the ideas would get out there sooner, and be more easy to read. And I had hoped that the articles might be incorporated into professors' classes if they're teaching about food insecurity or teaching about food systems issues or education. Um, so that was the reason that I chose those. I found that it was really great to write 3 articles because you have to really um, condense your ideas and be able to sort of separate them into pockets that make sense based on whatever journal you want to publish with. And so for me, that part was really fulfilling because I could have a small, I mean, not that small, but I could have a goal of writing this article and getting out these ideas that came out of my dissertation because I had so much data, and then move on to the next set of data that I was really interested in getting out there into the world. And it felt like a very tangible way to do that. Um, I also found that just in terms of, right, if anybody's, in the midst of writing their dissertation or using PAR, that what felt really useful to me was reflecting along the way. So right when I would have a class right when I would, I'd record all my classes with my students. I would record everything I was doing, and then I would write up the transcription, but I would also write up my reflections about it right afterwards. And so to have both of these pieces where it's the actual outcomes as well as my own reflections about it, those were so useful when I went back and I was doing my data analysis and my coding and finding my themes. It was kind of all right there for me. And then, of course, having a lot of quotes was really helpful as well.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Uh, let's see. I think I'm just checking whether we have time for one last question or not. Can't you?
Just say a little bit about the 3 article dissertation
Yeah, 'cause that's
Rachel
different. I've
did.
never heard of
For
it.
those of you who are wondering, what is that? I've never heard of that. It departs from sort of a traditional 5-chapter dissertation, but it has some similarities. So the first chapter was a framing of the problem and, putting out the questions and describing the significance and the need for the study the same way any traditional dissertation would. It's followed by another chapter, which is a literature review, and also a chapter that presents the theoretical frameworks for the study. So again, that's very traditional. And then there's a methodology and methods chapter. But what is different and where this dissertation departs from a traditional one is then usually chapter 4 is your findings. And instead of findings, Rachel wrote 3 different articles, which, would have their own little introductions and literature reviews and method sections, but then present a part of what she learned in the dissertation tailored to a certain audience and a certain topic, given a journal that the article or chapter was geared towards. And then the final chapter, the conclusions, returns to the research questions from chapter 1 and discusses the articles in terms of how they address the research questions. And, it is a great way. I've worked with so many students over the years who've said, oh, I really should publish my dissertation. And when your dissertation is a bunch of articles, you're ready to publish it as soon as you've defended. And the bonus is your defense and your committee serve as the first line of peer review in a way. And so you get that feedback on the articles as part of the defense, and then you could revise them and submit them to journals after that. One
So
question.
I'm sorry, did you have the journals picked out ahead of time and pre-approved that you would, I mean, I guess there's a little, or you wrote these articles first and then you shopped them around to journals?
Yeah, so I had 3 articles in mind as I was writing the dissertation. And it just so happened that there was a special issue about college food insecurity through a journal as I was writing my dissertation, as I was writing everything up. So one of the articles I was writing actually to be published while I was, and then the other 2 I wrote as, okay, after I defend my dissertation, after this is all over, I'll have one article that's actually published at that point, and then I'll have 2 more that I am ready to find places to publish. And then at that point, I looked around for where I could publish those articles.
That's fantastic and great, especially if you're on a faculty track. There was a question, and this will be our last question because there'll be a few announcements. I just want to say we're going to make a few announcements, tell you what the next dissertation dish is, and a few reminders about recording and all that. But the last question is somebody, and they didn't share widely, but sent to me. What was your inspiration for using PAR
Mm-hmm.
rather than grounded or other qualitative methods? If you want to share anything about that.
That's a good question. Yeah, I read a lot about PAR, and I felt like it was the methodology that spoke to me the most in terms of being both theoretical and applied. And that action piece of PAR was really important to me because I knew that I wanted to do this project and I wanted to look at food insecurity with my students. And I knew that I would have a full semester to do this. And I wanted a framework that would help guide me throughout that semester in a very action oriented and practical way. And so I felt that PAR listed these steps in ways that felt very clear to me. And to be able to have an action kind of, at the end of the semester, you have your final. And for us, our final was our action projects. and then our reflection about the action project. So it felt to me like such a wonderful way to do research in an educational institution because it offered everything that I could ask for, right? It gave me a chance to do something action oriented and theoretical and learn about an academic subject and teach students about research methodologies. So it felt really perfect for me.
Thank you. So we're going to do a transition here, but before we do that, I want to invite folks to drop some love in the chat for Rachel. I think congratulations. This was just a wonderful, wonderful presentation of your research. I learned a lot. And so please drop some love to Rachel and appreciation to her in the chat. And as we transition, I want to remind everyone, and thank you, Dave, for co-moderating that. We have another dissertation. We do about 4 of these a year. Every now and then we'll throw in another special one that we just can't let slip by. Our next dissertation dish will be on Monday, April 14th, and we'll send all this to you with our recording and with an evaluation and a link to the slides, etc. And I think we'll have the links to the 3 articles since Rachel doesn't have your traditional like full dissertation thing. But anyway, Monday, April 14th, we're going to be featuring Dr. Stephanie Brewer from Michigan State University and her topic, Academic Community Engaged Learning and Student Mental Health and Wellness, Understanding the Lived Experiences of Undergraduate Students. Before we go to the next slide, I just want to say what comes next after I give a few logistics is we move, for those who want to stay on and have a deeper discussion with Rachel, with Dr. Brand, please stay on and we will stop the recording and move into a less formal format for 30 minutes of just talking with Rachel about her research, or it might be a chance for you to ask her questions directly, etc. So we are recording this webinar. It'll be available within a week on the Lead California YouTube channel, and we will send out a link to all registrants once it's available. So if anyone had to step off early, they'll still get it. There'll be a follow-up email from GivePulse with a link to the evaluation, and we'd love to get your feedback. I shared what the next dissertation dish is, and we have a few other webinars and conferences we want to highlight real quick. We have our this is like our 22nd Continuums of Service Conference happening this year up in Seattle, Washington, the Western Region Continuums of Service Consortia. We have early registration going on right now. If you scan the QR code, which you'll also get in the slides in your email, you can go to the registration page, learn more about the theme and everything else. And I am going to turn it over to Brian to say a few words about the next few slides.
Thanks, Elaine. Just wanted to highlight also for everyone on the call that IR Slice is fast approaching in the fall, August 13th through the 15th. One of our collaborating organizations of Dissertation Dish, and they've asked us to put out the notice that they're accepting proposals through February 3rd. So I would encourage you can scan the QR code and check that out, or go to their website, irslice.org, to learn more. And that conference will be in South Africa this year. So very exciting to be over in South Africa. And then lastly, we just wanted to promote at GivePulse, we'll be hosting a webinar on the 28th on a little bit more about building an engagement ecosystem through technology. And so we'll be highlighting 2 of our partners that are heavy users and collaborators on the GivePulse platform, El Pasoans Fighting Hunger, the local food bank in El Paso, and the University of Texas at El Paso. They were just honored this year as one of our partnership, sort of elevating our significant partnerships on the platform and sort of engagement of tracking the level of impact that they're having. So kind of appropriate, also giving Rachel's topic around food insecurity, that will be highlighting this work and this important engagement. So I encourage you to check that webinar out as well. I think that's all we have.
Great. So again, thank you to Rachel and to Dave for really a great conversation, and obviously to Rachel for all the great research that you and your students did. So we're going to transition now to we're going to stop the recording, and I invite you to take your